For a person so charming and so likable, indeed lovable, he can do some pretty cruel things when you're filming. It seemed to me at times that the end justified the means.
Stanley Kubrick's The Shining seems to be the quintessential example of a film that people cannot help but talk about to the point of exhaustion. Sparking discussions is one thing, but over the years, it's just turned into a brain-rot version of Telephone. Did you know that the entire set was cursed? And that Kubrick was subtly confessing his involvement in filming a fake moon landing? And that he hid the number 42 throughout the film as a reference to the Holocaust? There's 42 cars and trucks in the parking lot. You should count them. On this license plate, 42. And the title of the movie Wendy's watching, it's called The Summer of 42. And 2 times 3 times 7, room 237, that's 42. And the bar stools are arranged in 4 and 2. And there are 42 characters, and all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, including spaces. And Jack Nicholson, he was 42 when they filmed it right here. Just 6 cases of 7-Up. He's 6 times 7-Up. That's 42 up. So Kubrick, he was a reptilian alien who faked his own death, and he's only appeared publicly as Tony Clifton. I know I'm joking here, but that 42 actually is weird. But arguably the most widespread rumor was that Kubrick emotionally pushed Shelley Duvall so hard that she was permanently traumatized by the experience. This was only further exaggerated in 2016 after a truly ugly, mean-spirited promotional clip for Dr. Phil surfaced featuring an interview with Duvall seemingly in a fragile mental state.
Friday on an all-new Dr. Phil. The Shining's Shelley Duvall, from red carpet to near recluse.
I loved Robin Williams. I don't think he's dead.
Where do you think he is?
Shape-shifting.
I'm sorry I even showed that clip and that I have it on my hard drive. I'll just burn the hard drive completely. Of all the apocryphal stories surrounding The Shining, this is the only one I really care anything about. Just an easily digestible, juicy tabloid story that a lot of people willingly accepted, but more importantly, it does a horrific disservice to another human being who, unfortunately now, can't speak for herself. But she did, along with dozens of other cast and crew members.
Door open. On the record, I got such a bollocking because they said, turn over, and I got all ready, and then they said, never mind.
So I want to set the story straight. With the help of 8 books, 6 documentaries, and dozens of interviews detailing the making of The Shining, I've put together a confirmed, fact-based account of exactly what transpired between Kubrick and Duvall. What I found out, I didn't expect, and believe me when I tell you, it's not what you think.
You've got a big surprise coming to you.
Very good, Jack. Excellent. Right, check the gate, Doug.
But it's hard to talk about Stanley Kubrick without mentioning his acute attention to visual detail. And with plugins provided by this video's sponsor, Film Convert, you can have full control over your image. Film Convert makes powerful, easy-to-use color grading tools available for Adobe Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, and Final Cut. My partner Kenny's been using Film Convert's plugins for several years, like Cinematch, which helps you color correct your footage accurately, even if you're shooting with a variety of cameras. You can easily pick the brand, model, and setting of your camera with their library, which is updated constantly. Other plugins like Halation and Hazy can add that dreamy film glow, and Nitrate has this huge collection of film stock emulations that can match your camera's color science, which includes customizable film grain from Super 8 to Super 35, giving it that nostalgic 1970s feel. So whether you're an expert or just starting out, we highly recommend checking out Film Convert, and you can use our promo code BACKFOCUS for 10% off, or click the link in the description. Thanks. When Kubrick set out to cast the part of Wendy Torrance, Shelley Duvall was at the forefront of his mind, especially after seeing her performance in Robert Altman's Three Women.
Well, I'll tell you what. If you don't like the way I intend to live around here, why don't you just move out?
In the book Kubrick and Odyssey, he's quoted as saying, "I think Shelley Duvall, in addition to being a wonderful actress, perfectly embodies the kind of woman who remains married to a man like Jack Torrance, even though she knows he's brutally assaulted their son. You certainly couldn't have Jane Fonda play the part. You need someone who is mousy and vulnerable."
He was interested in a person that was probably more in love with her partner than her partner was with her, and who was needy in the relationship, and would seem to be able to be perceived as somebody that might tolerate the intolerable longer than one would think that someone might. And she was able to be very needy.
Stephen King wasn't crazy about the casting, but then again, he hated the whole movie anyway. In a 1979 interview for Fangoria, King said, quote, "I always saw in my own mind Wendy Torrance as a kind of a middle intelligence, beautiful piece. Shelley Duvall just looks sort of nervous and overbred. Ugh."
Shelley Duvall as Wendy is really one of the most misogynistic characters ever put on film. She's basically just there to scream and be stupid, and that's not the woman that I wrote about.
Luckily, King would have the last word with his incredible, more faithful miniseries adaptation of The Shining in 1997, which is, that's completely eclipsed Kubrick's version. On April 10th, 1978, Shelley Duvall arrived in England to meet Stanley Kubrick for the first time. Emilio D'Alessandro, Kubrick's longtime personal assistant and driver, wrote about their meeting in his book, Stanley Kubrick and Me, 30 Years at His Side. Quote, "She seemed to me a bit vulnerable. When I met her, she had just finished her interview in Stanley's office. She reminded me of Olive Oyl in the Popeye cartoons." That's kind of wild, considering that she would eventually play Olive Oyl 2 years later. Like, nobody knew that was in production or that Shelley would play the part at the time. Anyway, he continues. "She was incredibly slim and arms dangled by her sides. Vivian was in the office that day too, and I remember noticing that Vivian was the only person Shelley smiled at. It was as if, unlike the others, Vivian didn't intimidate her." Emilio's referring to Kubrick's daughter, Vivian, 17 at the time, who helped out on set and eventually shot the making of documentary. After more setups and some costume fittings and rehearsals, Shelley's first day of shooting was approaching. The initial block of time she was scheduled for seemed reasonable, 18 weeks, or 126 days. That's not so bad. As the shoot began, things started off smoothly. It's important to note that Kubrick shot The Shining more or less in continuity, so most of May was real simple stuff that you see early on in the movie. Wendy's scene with the doctor, lunch with Danny, breakfast in bed, and a lot of Ullman giving a tour of the Overlook.
We're all gonna have a real good time.
Shelley and the cast did get a little taste of Kubrick's tendency to do a lot of takes. And just a quick aside on the subject of takes, there seem to be two main reasons why Kubrick did this. One reason, which we already covered in our Eyes Wide Shut video, was this kind of obsession to fully explore a scene, and it's like he never knew what he wanted, but he knew what he didn't want. This could include extensive rehearsals and rewrites, more rehearsals, more rewrites, and then shooting sometimes dozens of takes. John Baxter, author of Stanley Kubrick, a biography, talks about how these multiple takes would sometimes push the actors to a point where they felt like they had nothing left, and then they would find this second wind. It would actually put them in a state of mind to try ridiculous things.
Finally, the actor had nothing left to give, and Kubrick would still want more. So the actors would start doing crazy stuff.
Come out, wherever you are.
Funny faces, screaming, howling. And if you look at Nicholson's performance in the film, they're the scenes you see, the 27th and 29th take. But to get those, he had to work his way through. It's very difficult to say, all right, take one, you're crazy. It won't work.
I had never done more than, say, 15 takes before in my life. So it was a great change for me to do so many. But then after you do a certain number, it sort of goes dead. And then 5 more takes or so, and it revives itself, and by then you know the scene like the back of your hand, and you can make no mistakes with it, and you forget all reality other than what you're doing. And it's like a miracle. It comes out better than it did before.
The second reason why Kubrick did this was pretty simple. Sometimes the actors didn't know their lines. No one really had a problem with that the first month of shooting until Scatman Crothers. This poor guy. Everybody loved him. He just had this trouble with memorization, especially the scene in which he talks to Danny in the kitchen about Shining. It took 4 days and 225 takes from different angles. He cried with exhaustion.
If you see tears, it will be tears of joy.
The shoot continued with some relatively simple scenes for Shelley, Wendy on the transistor radio, pushing a breakfast trolley, and watching a movie with Danny.
Oh, come on, hon. Don't be so grouchy.
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
The only major hiccup here was Nicholson being on hiatus for a couple weeks after he gave someone else's keys at a party. They forgot to give it to him, and then he couldn't get into his house, so he had to climb a wall, and then he fell off the wall, landed badly and hurt his back. So Kubrick just shot around him. But the first indication that Shelley was having a hard time began some 1 or 2 months into the shoot when she started intermittently getting sick.
From May until October, I was really in and out of ill health because the stress of the role was so great, and the stress of being away from home, just uprooted and moved somewhere else, and I had just gotten out of a relationship, and so for me it was just tumultuous.
When she returned to work after one bout of illness, Kubrick shot the scene in which Wendy approaches Jack in the gold room hysterical. This was Shelley's first scene in which she had to cry, and she did, over and over and over again.
There's someone else in the hotel with us. There's a crazy woman in one of the rooms.
According to Susan Alcott, wife to the DP on The Shining, John Alcott, Shelley had to lie down on the floor between takes. Quote, "They were very worried about her because she had these awful cramps." For the remainder of the shoot, Shelley would just be pushed to her limit, and she would also continue getting sick from the stress. No more casually walking around the Overlook, no more running around in the hedge maze with Danny, having fun. No, nearly every scene from that day forward required Shelley to be in a constant state of sobbing, screaming, and everything in between. In an interview with Vivian Kubrick, Shelley said, quote, "What's been most difficult for me is crying continuously and being in a state of hysteria, because you're dealing with your body. It's very difficult to tell your body when it's very happy and doesn't want to cry, but it's got to cry, to get upset and go to shake because it hurts. It's very painful. You have to dig up everything that ever hurt you. You go and listen to some loud music, work yourself up to be hysterical, use a little bit of glycerin and a little bit of menthol under your eyes, which starts them off."
So it got into the major core of the film. She almost had to constantly be in a state of hysterics and crying. And it was, if you can see just a little bit on her face, she's got this glistening. And after a while, she ran out of tears. So she was almost permanently daubed in glycerine because it was about the only way she looked like she was crying.
By the time they got to shooting the scene in which Wendy locks Jack in the larder, Shelley was really struggling. In the book Kubrick and Odyssey, one of the Steadicam operators, Ray Andrew, recalled that one morning Shelley asked to have a private word with Kubrick about why she couldn't shoot the scene. Kubrick said, quote, "I'm not moving. Whatever the f*** you have to say, you can say it right here." She responded, "I can't do this today because my period has just started." Kubrick stared at her and said, "Right." Then called for the nurse, who informed Kubrick she would need 3 days off. When they eventually started to work on the scene, in the middle of a rehearsal, Shelley collapsed, just on the floor. Nobody noticed right away because everyone was on the other side of the larder door shooting Jack, but script supervisor June Randall happened to come out and find her and propped her head up on some pillows. You can see this part in Vivian's making of documentary.
It comes and goes, and I've just been trying to...
Oh, dear.
It's just got so bad.
Yes. Oh, God, thank God I came out.
But there's something else going on here in this documentary that bothers me, and it's the way it's edited. Immediately before we see Shelley on the floor, she's being interviewed by Vivian and candidly admits to being a bit jealous of guests visiting the set and fawning over Nicholson because he was the bigger star.
Whatever. I mean, there were times where I felt a bit jealous because he got very, very much attention. And I suppose I like attention.
Then immediately after that, hard cut to her on the floor. I can't speak for Vivian's intentions, but that editing heavily implies that Shelley, she was looking for attention. She consciously decided to interrupt shooting and feign a fainting spell. There's no context provided, and in my opinion, it paints Shelley as an unprofessional, high-maintenance, attention-seeking person. Then came the staircase scene. After the reveal of Jack's all-work and no-play manuscript, Jack menacingly backs Wendy up a flight of stairs.
Jack!
This scene took 3 weeks to shoot. It's often cited incorrectly as requiring 127 takes, like, oh, it was in the Guinness Book of World Records, but that's not true. According to editor Gordon Stainforth in Stanley Kubrick, A Biography, it was only around 50 or 60. Still, it was grueling, and Shelley was still giving it her all.
I just want to go back to my room.
The crying continued into October, with Shelley struggling to maintain a high emotional state in the scene where Wendy she's just pacing, right? She's trying to figure out how to escape the hotel with Danny.
That's all there is to it.
According to chief electrician Lou Bogue, Shelley had left the room to listen to some music, to get her emotional and work herself up, and then she came back in ready to shoot. Kubrick took one look at her and said, "Your eyes are not quite red enough, Shelley. Go back out for another half an hour." Bogue continues, "I used to think, you wicked bastard. You are a sadist. I used to look at him and he'd laugh, and he knew exactly what I was thinking." A couple weeks later came the scene of Jack chopping through the bathroom door with Shelley screaming at the top of her lungs. It took several days of shooting, around 30 destroyed doors, and Shelley needed a doctor's visit after a splinter flew down her throat. Somehow, Shelley soldiered on, even though she was just at the end of her rope. In the book Stanley Kubrick and Me, 30 Years at His Side, Emilio D'Alessandro recounts a conversation he had with Shelley's driver, who approached him one day concerned. "When I take her home in the evenings, I can hear Shelley crying on the back seat. Are there problems on the set?" "Nothing," I answered. "Everything's just fine. Try to reassure her a bit if you can." The driver was a good person, and on the trips home he said to Shelley, "They told me that there's nothing to worry about. Stanley is very happy with you." For the record, Emilio, he's not lying when he said that there were no problems on the set. He just didn't personally see anything. He goes on to say in his book, quote, "I never heard Stanley treat her really unkindly, but I had no doubt that she found filming the scenes emotionally exhausting." Thankfully, after all this, Shelley had nearly a month off, as Kubrick shot various scenes with Jack running around the maze, walking around the gold room with all the extras, Grady in the bathroom, and O'Halloran's death scene in the hotel lobby. Surely at this point, there can't be much left for Shelley to shoot. Oh, there's 103 days left. Shelley returned to work for the argument about room 237 between Jack and Wendy in the hotel room. This is seen in the documentary as well, with Kubrick giving Shelley some blunt notes.
And I still think you shouldn't jump on every single emphatic line. It looks fake. It really does. It looks like you...
When I'm that nervous, it's a lot.
Shelley, I'm telling you, it's too many times. Every time he speaks emphatically, you're jumping, and it looks funny.
A little more than 3 weeks later, after Jack shot his frozen death scene and got his picture taken in a tuxedo to be superimposed in the party photo, he was wrapped. Shelley would have to do several scenes without him, including some pickups of her and Danny in the bathroom hiding from Jack. In Vivian's documentary, Shelley takes a cigarette break in between setups of this scene, and there seems to be this little half-joking, half-irritation between her and Kubrick.
Well, I don't sympathize with Shelley.
Don't sympathize with Shelley.
It doesn't help you.
Yes, it does. It does. Yes, I know.
Let's go.
Right, okay. Boys, want the video is going to be around here. Get this all set up.
This is another one of those moments people point to when they say Kubrick was purposely manipulating Shelley's emotions in order to get a good performance. To my surprise, there is some truth to this. As authors Robert P. Kulker and Nathan Abrams put in their book, Kubrick and Odyssey, the crew had meetings, not seen in the documentary, about how he wanted them to treat Duvall. "The only way we're going to get Shelley to cry and be miserable today is if we're shitty to her," he said. "I'll be shitty to her. Brian, you'll be shitty to her. Terry, you'll be shitty to her." Then he told assistant director Michael Stevenson and production manager Doug Twitty to be nice, fatherly figures to her. Between shooting isolated scenes with Scatman and Danny and these two guys, these lovebirds, the remainder of Shelley's scenes were mostly a gauntlet of just her running around and screaming in a panicked state. React to the ghost. React to the skeletons. Just react. Run around, scream. Again, run around, scream. Again, run around, scream. And then they got to this scene where Wendy is supposed to open this door and run outside. This was infamously featured in the making of documentary in which Shelley somehow missed her cue, irritating Kubrick.
Right. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll
2
video?
seconds.
We're fucking killing ourselves out here, and you're going to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
Should we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I
Yeah,
can't
but when
hear.
you came in like this, you said just...
We're sitting there because they say, wait a minute, and then you say on the radio,
But when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time now.
I can't even get
Well,
this
push
freaking
it
door
against
open.
it.
You
At this point in my research, I was kind of frustrated again because now, after learning about the context of Shelley's fainting spell in the kitchen, I started to not trust this documentary. Like, why was this argument chosen and singled out? Was there something else going on that day that I'm missing? And I continue to have questions, like, why did Emilio say that everything seemed fine with Shelley, even though that there were so many reports that she was having a miserable time? Did he really just miss that? Why do people seem irritated with Shelley all the time in the documentary?
And they said, video rolling and all that, and I got all ready, and jumped up and down, and then they said, never mind, cut it. And then I went to take a bite of soup, the next thing I know, action Shelley. So.
Even in the commentary, Vivian's like, oh, there she is, moaning about something again.
When Shelley's like moaning about her hunks of hair, and my dad sort of like takes these 3 follicles up 2 inches from the lens, that this was his own, like, I want this recorded.
And if there are claims that Kubrick didn't mistreat her, why are we hearing that he ordered crew members to treat her differently, like a manipulative good cop, bad cop routine? Why did Angelica Houston say she, quote, seemed genuinely a bit tortured, shook up? I don't think anyone was being particularly careful of her. David Hughes, author of The Complete Kubrick, claimed that Shelley was driven to, quote, nervous collapse as Kubrick harangued the actress again and again. Co-screenwriter Diane Johnson said that Shelley herself later told her that, quote, she was driven crazy by the process of shooting the film. She felt that Kubrick didn't like her and drove her unmercifully. Was he actually a monster? What about when Kubrick, according to one of the Steadicam operators, Ray Andrew, Kubrick grabbed a dolly grip's throat and pushed him against the wall after the grip questioned Kubrick's directing? At this point, I was beginning to be more confused than when I started. Luckily, I found a way to clear things up once and for all. It's time to bring out the big guns. This absolute unit of a box set is called Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and it is, without a doubt, the most comprehensive, end-all, be-all last word about the production of The Shining, and we have one unlikely person to thank for it. Disney Pixar director Lee Unkrich.
I first saw The Shining when I was 12 years old. My mom took me to see it in theaters when it first came out, and it was unlike any film that I had ever seen before. It really got under my skin in a way that I didn't quite understand at the time.
Lee spent his life obsessed with The Shining. He even snuck in various Shining references in Pixar films he worked on. He admits that Sid's carpet, that's definitely the Overlook Hotel carpet, that wasn't his idea, but he did sneak the number 237 into Toy Story 3, and Coco has a couple references, like a Sugar Skull version of the Grady twins, and this axe modeled after the one Jack used. They're just all over the place.
Here's Brucey!
Lee spent 12 years interviewing every living person still around who was involved with The Shining, but most importantly, he was able to make routine visits to the Stanley Kubrick Archive, which contains hundreds of boxes of material that Kubrick meticulously organized and labeled. He even, he managed to custom make the boxes to a particular size so that the lids would come off easily, but not so easily that they would fall off all the time. It's crazy. There's actually a whole documentary about this called Stanley Kubrick's Boxes, in which journalist and filmmaker John Ronson was invited to Kubrick's home to examine what Kubrick had left behind.
How many boxes would you say there are in total?
I really can't say. I mean, clearly over 1,000. Yeah, but I wouldn't know, because they're all over the place.
Where are they?
Oh, everywhere in the house. I mean, half the house was filled with boxes and trunks.
What Unkrich managed to do with this book was what I had been trying to do with all these biographies and the documentaries and the interviews, and that's create a full objective account, no sugarcoating, of the production of The Shining. And with it, an objective account of what happened with Shelley. So armed with this vast collection of information, let's rewind and fill in some gaps. The first couple of weeks for Shelley were not as smooth as I had originally thought. According to Unkrich, Shelley had an initial lack of confidence as she performed. Quote, when she made a mistake, she would stop, whereas Nicholson, if he ran into trouble, would keep going. This was observed by Emilio D'Alessandro, who recalled an exchange between Kubrick and Duvall. Quote, don't worry, if it's not right, we'll do it again, said Stanley in an attempt to calm Shelley down, but she just became more and more insecure. Shelley, do the scene just as I told you, and then after we'll see if it's okay, Stanley insisted. You always say okay to Jack. Why don't you ever say that to me? Is there something wrong? She asked, bewildered. Shelley, just do the scene. This anecdote lends some credence to the theory that there was a major learning curve for Shelley in terms of how different Kubrick's directing style was from Robert Altman. You gotta remember, at this point in Shelley's career, yeah, she had 10 years behind her, of experience, but with the exception of a supporting role in Annie Hall, all of her film work had been exclusively in Robert Altman's films. And by all accounts, if you were working with Robert Altman, you could expect to have significant creative input in a relaxed, improvisational atmosphere. It was also a completely different acting style, focused on realism and authenticity. And Kubrick has been quoted as saying, real is good, interesting is better. Unkrich quotes first assistant director Brian Cook describing Shelley as, quote, very, very fragile. She'd never come across anything like this. Such a long period of time and such huge hours and changing staffs and making it up as you go along and then doing lots and lots of takes. She'd done all those small independent films with Bob Altman. And remember how I mentioned Shelley was sick some of the time? Well, one time it was because she had caught something on a trip that she took to Monte Carlo with Ringo Starr, something that production objected to. They did not want her to leave in the middle of shooting. Even though she was off, Kubrick might need her. Unkrich says that when she returned sick, quote, judging from her own and crew recollections, her illness was the subject of gossip and some bad feelings behind the scenes. That could sort of explain why people may have been irritated with her, even if it was or wasn't justified. Another time, Shelley approached Kubrick to let him know that she was flying to Amsterdam with Ringo Starr after wrapping for the day. When both Kubrick and Nicholson said that she wouldn't be able to go, she broke into tears. First AD Brian Cook continues in Unkrich's book. And then she was pretty stupid with some of those things she used to do. She'd always be telling Stanley she was going out to dinner with Ringo or somebody. I used to say to her, Shelley, haven't you learned anything? Don't tell Stanley what you're doing socially. He'll keep you here till 11 o'clock tonight. He's only interested in the film. He's not interested whether you're going out to the Bob Dylan concert with Ringo Starr. As far as problems with how she worked, Shelley readily admits in Unkrich's book that she would have trouble in scenes where she had to look shocked or terrified, not just because of the physical exhaustion, but because she would laugh. And if you want to piss off a director and crew that's been working for hours on end, yeah, just start laughing. The infamous staircase scene is an example. In Unkrich's book, Shelley said, quote, I will admit that when we first started the scene, I didn't do a shocked look very well, and Stanley knew it. When it came to the shooting of a serious scene, whether it be looking shocked or terrified, I couldn't do it. I would start giggling. After a while, Stanley became impatient with me and just let loose. Unkrich goes on to say, they eventually finished, and Duvall would admit that Kubrick got a great performance from her. So already with all this extra information, we're getting a more nuanced picture. I am not by any means suggesting that the way Kubrick sometimes treated Shelley was justified, but it's important to hear these stories to understand that his frustrations didn't just come out of thin air. And he also wasn't completely devoid of empathy. There's this view of him that he really is this megalomaniacal, awful guy. But when it came to Scatman Crothers, for example, with his scene in the kitchen and not being able to remember the dialogue, Stanley, he was definitely frustrated, privately. But in front of Scatman, he was understanding and warm. From Unkrich's book, one of the ADs told Kubrick, you should just send him home, Stanley. No, what are you talking about? If I send him home now, he's gonna feel like he'd failed. Stanley just said, don't worry, do it again. And when Scatman broke down and hugged him out of exhaustion, Stanley said, it's okay, Scat, don't worry. One thing Unkrich managed to do that I was really happy with was provide some additional context to this argument between Kubrick and Duvall. We see the argument, he yells at her, she yells back, she vents to the camera, to Vivian about the whole situation, but what we don't see in the documentary is Shelley running off crying and Kubrick approaching the second AD, Michael Stevenson, and saying, "Michael, you better go around and see her." In Unkrich's book, Michael says, quote, "I went round and of course she was in tears. I said, Shelley, it's hard for you, but I'll tell you something else. You don't want to be where I am, standing next to Stanley out here in this freezing cold. Nobody wants to be out here, but we've got to be out here. This is our job. The sooner we get this shot, the sooner we can all go home and go to our warm beds." She was crying, and then she said, "Mike, he's really being tough with me." I said, "Shelley, it's a tough scene, and we've got to get it right. Because we've got all the snow machines going, we've got to get the smoke looking right, and you know Stanley is a perfectionist. So I'm going to warn you now, Shelley. It's going to be a lot of takes. It might end up being 30 takes. Stanley knows that. We got it finally, but that was one of the times when Stanley was pretty tough with her." But why include this in the documentary? Like, I understand it's kind of this dramatic moment, it's compelling. This was supposed to be a documentary made for British television. It had to be squeezed into 30 minutes, so you can only include so much. But something Unkrich did in his book was confirm that while Vivian was technically responsible for shooting the documentary and editing it down, Stanley was the one who had final cut approval. In Unkrich's book, editor Gordon Stainforth, who helped Vivian edit the documentary, said, quote, "I would say it was an almost false picture, because he was actually underneath a very gentle, incredibly well-mannered guy. It was quite rare for him to be getting cross like that. So there were two sequences that we put together for Vivian's documentary of Stanley actually directing, but they aren't in the final edit. They weren't very long sequences, but they showed him directing and they showed him in a rather warm light. There was certainly one scene of Stanley directing Shelley, which showed him working very closely and warmly with her. They didn't show him in that aggressive light. Vivian and I were so disappointed when Stanley came to watch our first edit, and when he saw those sequences of himself directing, he said, "Oh, I don't like those." Finally came Shelley's last day, which involved a reshoot of Wendy crying with Danny in their apartment. But she was in high spirits, not just because the film was coming to an end, but she was looking forward to acting in Robert Altman's next film as Olive Oil in Popeye. From Unkrich's book, quote, "After all of that crying in The Shining, it was a real treat for me to play Olive Oil." She also noted that Altman found her to be a changed artist since she'd suffered with Kubrick for a year. "My part in The Shining broadened my scale as an actress. Without it, I could have never done Olive Oil."
So I resented Stanley at times because he pushed me, and it hurt. And I resented him for it. I thought, why do you want to do this to me? How can you do this to me? You agonize over it, and it's just the necessary turmoil to get out of it what you want out of it. I mean, we had the same end in mind. It was just that sometimes we differed in our means. And by the end, the means met.
Shelley would go on record multiple times over the years about how, although it was difficult for a number of reasons, and she doesn't sugarcoat that, the experience changed her for the better.
I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Why? Because of Stanley. And it was a fascinating learning experience. It was such intense work that I think it makes you smarter, but I wouldn't want to go through it again.
Shelley would indeed suffer with some mental health issues in life, though she never went into detail. But according to Sarah Lakowski, a fan who befriended Shelley in the last years of her life, she was not permanently traumatized like people think. Quote, "Shelley unfortunately has struggles with her mental health, but that has nothing to do with The Shining. In all my very recent conversations with her, she still speaks highly of The Shining and how she loved Kubrick. She still holds no grudges." And Sarah brings up another good point. It's not like Shelley was preoccupied with The Shining for the rest of her life. Like, she went on to have a successful career as an actor and especially a producer in children's television. She earned 2 Emmy nominations, one for Tall Tales and Legends and the other for Fairy Tale Theater. And for all the negative things that came out about the relationship, there seemed to be just as many positive things to talk about that nobody talks about. She loved playing chess with him, something Kubrick often did with cast and crew members. They chit-chatted, they threw parties, and she really did appreciate the collaboration, stating in a 1981 interview, quote, "To my great surprise, Kubrick gave us a great deal of freedom to Jack Nicholson and myself in our acting." In a 2021 interview for The Hollywood Reporter, Shelley said that Kubrick, quote, "was very warm and friendly to me. He spent a lot of time with Jack and me. He just wanted to sit down and talk for hours while the crew waited." So in the end, what is the truth? I know people tend to love a good, juicy story in which there's a clear-cut villain and a victim, or a frustrated director and a whiny diva. The truth is, Kubrick could be kind and cruel. And Shelley, she had this incredibly difficult job, but she was not perfect either. It's almost like these are real, flawed, nuanced human beings, not characters in a movie. It may not be the most satisfying of explanations, but then again, real life can be pretty disappointing. And after years go by, people soften, and if you're lucky, the bad memories fade and the good ones stick around. And ultimately, the last word on all of this belongs to Shelley herself. So I'll just let her tell you.
We had a good relationship, actually, even though there was some differences from time to time. I knew Stanley loved me. Period. And at the end of The Shining, Stanley Kubrick and I were both crying. It was so sad. It was he said, "I don't want it to be over." I don't want it to be over. I don't want it to end. And I said, I know.